Good afternoon to you all. Thank you for joining us on what I hope is a very hot Tuesday afternoon for you. It's a pleasure to be here once more. As Olivia said, we are now on session 4 of our collaborative programme between the Classical Association and the Historical Association. And today we are going to be focusing on developing or how to develop an ancient history curriculum. I am joined as ever by an expert panel. I have Steve Maston, who is of course known to so many at the Historical Association. I'm joined by Anna McComish and Emma Beetham, both of whom are very experienced ancient history and modern history teachers. And you can follow us all on Twitter, and perhaps if you are watching and you are on Twitter, please do sort of tweet live so that we can follow you back. As Olivia mentioned, if you could just pop your questions into the chat as we move through, we will obviously keep this fairly informal, so there'll be plenty of opportunities to respond to any questions or any comments that you leave at various points through today's session, and we would love to hear from you. And it could be something that is specific to today's session, or perhaps something that has cropped up in previous sessions that you would like you'd like us to follow up on. Before I hand over to our first speaker today, just to outline what we are going to cover in this afternoon session, we're going to look at how ancient history can be successfully embedded across key stages 3, 4 and 5, because people will be coming at this with various different opportunities available to them in their departments. Each of those speakers will also reflect on the positive impact that they have had when they've been embedding ancient history into their history departments, not just in terms of the numbers in their departments, but also on their students' learning experiences. And then towards the end of the session, I will reflect and remind you on the support that is available to those of you that are new to teaching ancient history, both within the history community and within the classics community. So we are going to start off with Key Stage 3, and I'm going to hand straight over to Anna.
Hi, good afternoon. Again, thank you to everyone who's joined us this afternoon. I hope that you have survived a very hot day in a secondary school. I'm Anna McComish. Some of you might have bumped into me before or recognise my voice if you've attended any of the OCR GCSE training sessions or kind of preparing to teach. I lead those, and like Grania was saying, I am a history and an ancient history teacher. I'm currently head of a history department at a very, very large, very mixed school in Walsall near Birmingham, and we teach the history and ancient history GCSE. So what I've done as part of that to support that, because I want the spiral curriculum, I want the foundational schemata, and I want students to be able to come into the ancient history GCSE with a taste and a flavour of the world to understand the landscape and key themes within it. We've made significant adaptations to our Key Stage 3, which we find really beneficial and really supportive. And what I will be talking through, with the help of my glamorous assistant, Grania, who'll be moving the slides for me. Thank you, Grania, in advance for that. I just want to kind of talk you through what our Key Stage 3 curriculum looks like and how we make it work, in case it is of interest for anyone else to take it up. So thank you, Grania. This is our Key Stage 3 curriculum for the current academic year. Lots of this obviously is real bread and butter of the Key Stage 3 curriculum stuff. It's not that ancient history is the only place that we're making changes, but it will be the ancient history that I'm focusing on today. So if you have a quick gander at this table, you can see that we do an ancient topic in each year group of Key Stage 3, which is one of those big changes we made probably about 3 years ago. We sat down in the summer as a department and I said, look, we've introduced the ancient history GCSE. It's running really well. We get great numbers for it. I'd like to make some adaptations to the Key Stage 3 curriculum to support that. And my department were brilliant, and credit where it's due. They jumped on it, enjoyed it, followed me with it, and this is the current makeup of our Key Stage 3 curriculum. We do ancient Greece at the end of year 7. It's essentially a whip through of the highlights of 5th century BCE Greece. So there's fathers of history, Herodotus and Thucydides, I taught that today. There's a lesson on Greek drama, Greek government. Obviously, we do the Olympians because they're year 7 and we enjoy it as well. So that's a kind of, the inquiry question for it is, what have the ancient Greeks ever done for us anyway? And obviously a great homage to Monty Python. The end of year 8 is a period study ancient topic where we essentially look at the rise and fall of the Roman Empire. It does a lot to provide for the Rome depth study of the ancient history GCSE, which looks at 753 Romulus all the way up to from around about 404, Republic establishes itself. And then at the beginning of year 9, we do a topic on the ancient Middle East, which is 3000 BC all the way up to 479. We kind of cut things off when Xerxes appears. That is to support the Persia period study, which is taught in the beginning of year 10 when we do the ancient history GCSE. You can see obviously that the year 7 and year 8 topics are kind of at the end of the year when the pressure's off a little bit. These topics kind of feel in a way a bit more learning for the joy of learning, really. There's no formal assessment attached to them, and they don't come into their end of year assessments at all. The ancient Middle East topic exists at the beginning of year 9 because they do their options towards the kind of end of the autumn, the winter term. So we want ancient history to be fresh enough they can make an accurate and educated decision to do it, or equally as importantly, not to do the GCSE. Worst thing in the world is kids who hate history picking ancient history because they wanted to try something new. Which just never goes well. But yeah, great, thank you. So I just kind of wanted to talk through what I think are the obvious questions, or questions that I've certainly fielded when it's come to including ancient history at Key Stage 3. The why of it is a twofold thing. So as I said, it's important for me to supply that foundational schemata. I subscribe to that pedagogical practice. I believe in a spiral curriculum, and no part of what we do at Key Stage 3 is trying to teach GCSE content in a way that means I can essentially revise it when I start the GCSE. But Mike Hill has done some really interesting stuff about landscape and creating historical landscapes, which my interpretation of it anyway is it's just creating a world for them to go to. It's making sure they understand the ancient periods that they'll be visiting. So I think there's something really powerful about including ancient history in the Key Stage 3 curriculum so they know that world. It's a world building practice. But I also think that there could be something, obviously the Key Stage 4, Key Stage 3 curriculum starts broadly speaking with the Anglo-Saxons. Most of us start with the Normans. We might do a little bit of Romans, but I think there's something to be said about the fact that history doesn't just start with the Anglo-Saxons. Like, it's not just when it becomes relevant to Key Stage 3 kids. I think that ancient history is interesting and is relevant and gives really important parallels that kids can continue to benefit from. In terms of when, as we've seen, end of year 8, end of year 7, because there's no formal assessment attached. And as I'm going to go through in a second, what I think it allows us to do, putting these topics at the end of 7 and 8, is really nice opportunities for reflection. There's really good historical skills built into it by teaching ancient history. And then, as I said, beginning of year 9, because we want that foundational schemata, we also need them to be able to make educated choices about their history options. In terms of how we include it, obviously, it's a massive chronological shift. And we are an academy, technically, so I can deviate from the national curriculum within reason as I wish. And all I can say about it is we just lean into it. 3 years ago, when we sat down as a department and I said, look, I want to do this and I want to make these changes, that was one of the questions that came up from my staff is, well, exactly how is the rise and fall of Rome or the ancient Middle East going to slot in with the year that we teach the world wars and interwar years? We lean into it really heavily and we tell the kids, listen, we're just chopping and changing from the chronology for 6 weeks. We're doing it for these reasons. This is what we hope to get from it. And you're going to love it. I think there's a really important opportunity for the crossover of the themes that I mentioned previously. And if this is something that you're sat here and going, oh, I'm interested in that. Oh, I quite fancy doing that. Oh, I think that would really work for me. But you're going to have to get it past a head of department or a head of faculty or a member of SLT. The themes are how I would justify it on a pedagogical, a curricular level. So what I want to do now is just have a look at how the schemes of work, these ancient units are put together, inquiry questions for them, but CT stands for a connecting theme. And the connecting theme is how I teach these in relation to a wider curriculum that they do not necessarily chronologically align with. So obviously on the board for you now is what we are doing with year 7. I taught the invention of history today. And this, as I said, is meant to be a kind of, rip-roaring run-through of ancient Greece, the good bits, the fun bits, but stuff that I think is genuinely challenging for year 7s as well. It deals with really interesting historical notions. So when I wanted to put this unit together, obviously what I thought was really important that history students should study where history came from, and they should study the fathers of history and debate about their merits. So connecting things like interpretation, which we are, I'm assuming, teaching across all of our Key Stage 3 history curricula, comes into that lesson. We do Greek government, but it's a really nice opportunity for us to look at democracy and government as a theme, which we visit in earlier parts of year 7 when we do the Baronial War and Magna Carta and King John. So we can see connections there. We have a lesson on philosophy, which I honestly just love because it's fascinating, gets kids to really think about it. There's a nice bit of cross-curricular connection there. It connects with some of what our RST, our Religious Studies department, do. We look at women in Greece, we look at drama roles, and it actually allows us to look at gender roles, which reflects upon the teaching we look into of Matilda and Civil War with Stephen, Eleanor of Aquitaine, expectations of women in medieval and Tudor society. And the next example for you will show how in the lessons on ancient Greece, we encourage kids to reflect back upon that. I want them to understand that these themes have longevity to them. The cause and effect and that relationship of key historical themes doesn't just, like I said, start with the Anglo-Saxons. And actually, in studying the ancient world, what the kids get is a far longer view of it. And I'd argue a better understanding of how significant these themes are, given how far back they go. And then there's a few more examples: warfare and conflict, so on. So, oh no, thank you, Granny. That's great. No, you moved me on perfectly. That was great. So this slide here, I've just copy and pasted. I've stolen from the year 7 lesson on Greek women. And it's a really nice activity I love. There's a great website that's got 6 notorious women of ancient Greece. So I took the website, turned it into a nice little info document they can use, and they create biographies on their top 4. And it's just great because there's fantastic women that do amazing things, and they don't know about this when we start teaching them ancient Greece. The challenge task on the board is how I look into connecting those historical themes, important ideas in the study of history, into this topic to justify its place in the curriculum and justify this kind of switching up the chronology that we've had to do. So if you can see that the challenge task asks them to take some time to reflect about looking into Matilda, Eleanor of Aquitaine, Elizabeth I, other noble peasant women, because we have medieval women lessons and Tudor women lessons as well. And then I ask them how far the opportunities and lives of women have changed, which is always a great talking point. And with this activity, once we've finished it and we discuss it as a class, the challenge task, the discussion on that can be led by the students who have got to it, but the whole class can then be brought into the discussion, whether they've done the work or not. And it's fascinating. It's genuinely, absolutely fascinating that they can start to make parallels between really famous women from the ancient Greek world with those very comfortably established names that we take from the modern history. And it gives them that longevity. Ancient Rome, then, as a comparison. This is a topic which is a little bit bigger, so I've split it into 2 inquiry questions. I've tried to be interesting, and I didn't quite want to do why did Rome, or how did Rome rise, and why did Rome fall? So I tried to do a jazzy inquiry question by asking, how did Rome become the dominant imperial power in the Mediterranean? Doing the origins of Rome, the Roman kings, and the Roman Republic starts to world build for the Roman period study, the Foundations of Rome period study from the GCSE. So in a couple of years' time, hopefully, if they take the GCSE, it's not a completely novel concept to them. It's not something that's completely unknown to them. And then we just get into really good fun stuff. Like the Punic Wars is great. Like I defy anyone to teach Hannibal going over the Alps with elephants and not get some kids interested in that. It is genuinely brilliant. We have lessons on that in Carthage as well. Brilliant source work to do with it too. Rumblings in the Republic, which is what I thought was a really jazzy way to describe Pompey and Caesar going for each other. Thank you. And then the realities of Rome, the realities of the Roman Empire, actually utilize the Mary Beard documentary, and they kind of intersperse the documentary with activities around it because she does such a great job working with inscriptions and epigraphical sources left. So we get the kids to really dive into that. And actually, this Rome unit particularly is really interpretation heavy, really source heavy. Almost every lesson is using ancient sources, getting kids to dig into those as evidence, which is, again, interpretations is a key theme. It's a historical skill I want them to be building. And we depend on the source material so heavily in the ancient world that this topic does a great job of bringing kids to it. And again, looks at democracy, forming of governments, warfare, civil war as a theme. They do the English Civil War at the beginning of year 8. So what's really interesting is to get to the end of year 8, look at the Civil War of Rome, and again, ask them for comparison questions. Looking into the realities of Rome allows us to look at the lives of women, which is staggering in Rome, and they're often quite shocked to learn about that. But one of the things I find most powerful about doing this unit is that this is in the same year that we teach the Atlantic slave trade, that we teach the civil rights movement, Britain and America. And what is so interesting in the diverse Rome lesson using Mary Beard's documentary is to look at interpretations of race and ethnicity. And actually Mary Beard, when she was doing her keynote speech at the Historical Association this year, had a really good question from the audience about attitudes towards race and ethnicity in Rome. And Mary Beard herself said that actually you wouldn't witness racism in the same way you would in the modern day, that what matters so much more is to be a Roman citizen regardless of where you come from. And I cannot tell you how teaching this to year 8 has just blown open discussions. It has been such a brilliant way to reflect upon those themes of, you know, slavery in more modern history and the consequences of that, and actually how you know the West really clearly shifted perspective from an ancient perspective to get to the slave trade. So that's been fascinating. And then the change of inquiry question looks to why did the Roman Empire fall? And that's a really nice opportunity to look at notions of imperial power. They've done the British Empire in year 8 as well, and we do decolonization as part of that. So again, just really good historical parallels to help kids break down key historical themes that they're working with in the rest of the curriculum. I think there'll be an example next. Yeah, so again, I won't spend a terrible amount of time on this. This is just an information slide talking through key points. And then actually, before we even go into the events of Caesar and Pompey, I think pair share activity whereby we ask them to reflect on looking at the English Civil War in the 1640s, reflect upon what was damaging about that, because we have lessons on that. We use the world turned upside down woodcut, and to get them to familiarize themselves, remind themselves about the damage of civil war and how worrying that can be for nations, what nations will do to avoid it, to then prep them for going in and doing Caesar and Pompey. So again, how I'm linking it in. And then I think our last bit. So this is my ancient Middle East unit. This is the first one I did of these, and I used an absolutely brilliant book called The Cradle of Civilization by Stephen Bork. I got it from the British Museum, really recommend it. There's some really just brilliant bits I couldn't fit in, and like really sinister things about abandoned villages and kind of discovered models of humans. Loads of really, really good stuff in there if you're interested in kind of spooky, interesting ancient history. This scheme of work, directly relates to the GCSE. And off the back of Stephen Bork's book, I was interested in this idea of the ancient Middle East as the cradle of civilization. And I wanted to look at topics that could challenge that idea and get kids to understand and kind of adapt to that notion. So we do the City of which is forming nations and governments, which by this point, students can reflect on government forming from year 7, wars and government forming, empires forming as part of year 8. The Sea People, the Bronze Age collapse lesson is brilliant. It's just such a good use of sources compared to modern interpretations. Kids want to know why there was a massive ecological collapse and why societies forgot how to read and write, and they never built monuments again after that, and trade routes disappeared, and we don't have an answer. And I love a historical mystery that ultimately we can't give the kids an answer on. And so they get really het up and like really engaged by it. It's really good fun to teach. And then the inquiry question looks to go through the dominant dynasties of the ancient Middle East, because I want them to be able to do comparisons and ideas of kingship, of rise of empires, of what good leadership looks like in history. Interpretations, use of sources is a huge part of this as well. And I recently did a master's whereby I looked into the impact of teaching this for Muslim students. And what was really interesting is that without me leading them to it, because it was a first year group that went through it, I hadn't finessed it quite as well, my year 9 students made connections back to modern eras of history they'd done without my questioning or prompting, which is one of the things that made me really confident to go and make further changes in the Key Stage 3 curriculum 3 years ago, because I thought the kids are making the inferences themselves, so there is worth and there is value in here. But that's the last of our Key Stage 3 units and how we make it link. So yeah, I mean, obviously it might just be that you are, just think that's absolutely brilliant at all. But if anyone did have any questions for me, or I don't know, yeah, ask me later maybe. But thank you so much, and I hope that's been helpful.
That was so thorough. Thank you ever so much, Anna, and a really good, showcase of how you can embed it across all of the year groups at Key Stage 3. I'm going to invite Steve here to join us, because he's also had a very similar experience to Anna, who has embedded ancient history across the key stages, and he might be able to reflect on Key Stage 3 as much as he'll also reflect shortly on Key Stage 4. If you don't have any questions right now, but something does pop into your mind, please do use the chat function. We can come back to those as and when. Steve.
Great, thanks, Grania. If there's one thing I would suggest you read over the summer holidays. It's Mary Beard's Pompeii, Life of a Roman Town. So I don't know where you are at the stage of introducing ancient history for absolute certain at GCSE, or whether you're just dipping your toe in the water and exploring it for possibly the year after. But wherever you are, I'd recommend this book. It's a really nice link between what Anna was just speaking about there, which is introducing something in the ancient world at Key Stage 3, and then teaching the ancient world at GCSE. So I'm assuming that some of the people in the webinar today are teaching history at GCSE. So you're very familiar with the sorts of questions that come up. You're familiar with the changes in the specifications that were introduced several years ago. And so, of course, one of the big questions that you might be considering is how much work is involved in introducing this at Key Stage 4. So remember the starting point. Read Mary Beard's Pompeii over the summer holidays. Cannot stress that enough, because it will provide that link between Key Stage 3, and it will prompt lots of ideas about things you could teach, even if it's just one inquiry. You don't need to be as ancient history-tastic as Anna is in her school, but just introducing children to the idea of the ancient world means that when they get to options evening, they know what the ancient world is about. And of course, introducing the teaching of the ancient world through written sources, but also through sources. So of course, sources are just anything that people have left behind in the past, whether that's a monument, whether that's a piece of writing or a button or something they made, a piece of jewelry, whatever it is. And Mary Beard's book has lots and lots of examples. Of course it does, because we're talking about the excavation of Pompeii. So jumping ahead to Key Stage 4, if you do decide to explore GCSE ancient history, then really the course is divided into two sections, both of which I loved teaching. They were never boring. No lesson in GCSE ancient history was boring. And of course, it's to do with the teacher. Of course, teachers make every lesson interesting, but it's also simply the content. It is impossible to make GCSE ancient history boring. And I have to admit, I'll put my hand up and say that as a head of department for 17 years, where GCSE history was taught, and we had lots of classes at GCSE history, there were some lessons, maybe about the League of Nations, but okay, push that to one side, that weren't that interesting. But we had to teach them. You tried to make them as interesting as possible. You don't have that with the ancient world. The stories, from whatever period they come from, are just so fascinating. So GCSE ancient history is really a story of two halves. You have the Greeks and the Persians, so you can see that on the left, and then you have Rome, ancient Rome, and the neighbors of ancient Rome, so the places where Rome interacted. Now, those two halves, Greeks and Persians on the one hand, and Rome and Rome's neighbors on the other hand, really quite straightforward. Let me just talk you through for a few minutes those two halves. So the first half, Greek and Persian, is really looking at how the Persians, in their desire to build this empire, then interacted with the Greeks, obviously wanting to conquer the Greek city-states and bring them into the Persian Empire. So the depth study, looking at the Persian Empire, starts with what is believed to be the first Persian king, who then founds the Persian Empire when he conquers the city of Babylon, and he is Cyrus the Great. And it goes through just a few Persian kings, only 4 of them, the 4th one being Xerxes the First. So that's the compulsory element of the study of the Persian Empire and their interactions with the Greeks. And then you choose one of these 3 depth studies. Now, the one that I taught when I introduced ancient history, and I taught it for 7 years before I left that school, unfortunately, but we had lots of modern history classes, and then we had 2 big ancient history classes as well. And the unit that I taught was Alexander the Great. I'm not going to make any apologies for that. One of my absolute heroes in the past, if we're allowed to have heroes in the past anymore, loved teaching it. However, you can see that the other 2 options, if Alexander's not your thing and you don't want several battles, then Athens in the age of Pericles is a great unit. And also looking at how Athens became a democracy. So the first one from tyranny through oligarchy and then eventually to democracy is fascinating. So if you're interested in political history, then that's the one to teach. It is a great unit. If you're interested in this cultural unit of Athens in the age of Pericles, wonderful to teach, but my favorite was Alexander. So you choose one of those depth studies. Now, whichever of the depth studies you choose, that unit, the Persian Empire, and then one of those Greek depth studies, that has a source booklet. So every single source that could possibly come up in the exam, you've read it, you've seen it, the children have annotated it, you've used it in lessons, you've discussed it, so there will be no surprises in that one exam from the Greeks and the Persians. The second half of the course is, of course, Rome, ancient Rome and the neighbors of ancient Rome. So this is called the longer period study, but effectively it is what it says. It's just a bit longer compared with the Persian unit, where you start with the very first king of Rome, Romulus. There he is, suckling at the teat of the she-wolf. Fascinating story. Like I say, you just cannot make these stories boring. They're just wonderful to teach. And children, wide-eyed, are having big discussions about, is this history, is this legend? And of course, that interplay, because when these stories were written down for the first time in the age of Augustus, the first Roman emperor, these stories were all about making sure that Rome is seen as great, that Rome's past was great. And that first story of Romulus and Remus, where Romulus kills his brother Remus, the Romans believed that somehow this was the curse that was upon them, that forever they would be at war with each other. Why did Rome have so many civil wars? Why was Augustus at war with other Roman generals? Why was Caesar at war with the Senate? Well, Rome just believed that it was in their DNA, that it went back to Romulus and Remus, that it somehow was a characteristic of Romanness, that they were constantly in this struggle. So you look at the 7 kings of Rome in this depth study, and they are all interesting. Romulus is interesting enough, but all 7 kings of Rome are fascinating, particularly the last one where he is overthrown, his whole family are overthrown. The Romans rise up, they get rid of the monarchy, they never have a king again, and that word king becomes a dirty word, which is why when you get to the emperors, they never describe themselves using the Latin word for king, rex, because they abandoned monarchy and they established this republic. So you look at the early Roman Republic, the principles of establishing a Senate that was purportedly to represent the Roman people, but then this struggle between the wealthy noble Romans, the patricians, and the much, much larger group of Romans that were becoming very wealthy, and the middle-class Romans, but of course they were known as the plebeians. So these early struggles in the Roman Republic. So that's the compulsory period study. And then, just like the Greeks and the Persians, you choose another study. Now, the one I went for was Cleopatra. Wonderful link, because Cleopatra links the Greeks, which is the first study, if you remember, because Cleopatra, although we think of her as the last pharaoh of Egypt until she's gobbled up and defeated by Rome, and Augustus then becomes all-powerful and Egypt becomes a province. But of course, before Cleopatra is gobbled up by Rome, she is a descendant of one of Alexander the Great's generals. So there's that nice link that I thought there was to the Alexander the Great unit, where when Alexander dies, one of his generals becomes the pharaoh of Egypt. But of course, he's not an Egyptian at all, he's Greek, and his descendant is Cleopatra. So that's the reason I went for that unit. There's nice connections. But look at the other 2 units. They're fantastic as well. I wish I could have taught Hannibal. As Anna said, she got around that by introducing it at Key Stage 3, which is very clever. And the conquest of Britannia, where Britannia becomes a part of the Roman Empire, also a fascinating unit. So if you do have any questions about GCSE ancient history, do drop us a line. Gronier has given the email addresses and the contact details. Also contact the Historical Association. And if at any point in teaching GCSE ancient history, or even preparing for it by reading the specification, If you start to think, oh, this would be really hard to teach, or this doesn't sound that interesting, go back to what I just said a moment ago. It is impossible to make this dull. So if there's something you see where you think, how did you make that interesting? Tap up the Classical Association, tap up Gronya, tap up Classics for All, which I help out as well. We're happy to give you advice. There's lots of support out there for teaching GCSE ancient history. So I'm going to pause there. I'm going to stop sharing and see if there are any questions that come up in the chat about Key Stage 4.
We haven't had any questions as yet, but Steve, I had a question. You mentioned there that you had 2 large ancient history groups by the point that you were leaving your school, and I wondered how you built from scratch up to having 2 big ancient history classes that complemented, like that worked alongside your modern history group. How did you manage to how did you build that provision?
So of course that was a big decision because we were a large department and we were a popular option at GCSE. And so the thought of risking our big GCSE history classes with introducing another history, an ancient history, it was a risk. You know, I'm not going to lie. However, it bore fruit. If you look at the GCSE numbers, and this is something, Gronya, that I'm going to email you about because we need this data for anyone that asks about it. The numbers of ancient history classes, as they increase nationally, does not affect at all the number of history classes, and the data is there. So for any senior leaders who are worried about introducing GCSE ancient history, the figures speak for themselves. It won't affect your history numbers. In terms of how I introduced it, I mean, I must admit, I was the passionate one that wanted to introduce ancient history, and the rest of my department were all, well, a little bit twitchy. They were excited about the possibility, but they were a bit twitchy. Would they have to teach it as well? But there really is no difference between introducing a new specification for history, such as having to teach a Norman step study or having to teach Elizabeth I when you've never taught those periods at GCSE, and just going back a little bit further. And as I said, the stories are so interesting and so engaging that it's impossible not to have an interesting ancient history lesson. Does that answer your question, Gronya?
Thanks, Steve. And Anna, I was also hoping to ask you as well, did you, when you were introducing GCSE, had you already introduced it at Key Stage 3 and then built up, or was it that you decided to offer the GCSE and then worked your Key Stage 3 curriculum sort of backwards from that?
No, so we had, historically, when I joined my school as an NQT, it's old money ECT, guys, we had taught classical civilization. So pre-2017 Goguen reforms, that's what we taught. And it was taught like quite elite. I don't know if Steve kind of using this historically as well, that like classical civilization was kind of taught as like an elite subject, like there's only ever one class and it's quite small and it was considered higher ability and stuff like that. And it would always lead to a small but decent A-level cohort of classical civilization as well. Again, you know, higher ability. And then my then head of faculty came to me and said, look, we've done the reforms, EBACs come in. We are going to go to ancient history because it's EBACed, and the changes to classical civilization just didn't suit like our teaching style and our background and knowledge. And I was offered it when I started at NQT. I was offered A-level if I would teach ancient history. And obviously, like, I'm not an idiot. So I said, yes, of course, because you don't turn down A-level. And we kind of had this transition then from classical civilization, which had been relatively small, to ancient history GCSE. And we got 3 groups in our first year. It was really, really popular. Now, since then, when I then put the Key Stage 3 stuff in, which, you know, as I said, I wanted kids to be knowledgeable. We did have some kids in the first cohort who didn't know it that well and did the kind of, I don't like history, so I'll do ancient history thing. And then after the first year, then I put the Key Stage 3, or started thinking about the Key Stage 3 adaptions. And exactly as Steve was saying, through introducing it as a new subject, but it was definitely a revamp and a, you know, revving up of the subject to get it re-advertised and back out there. It has never had a negative impact on numbers. We have consistently kept high history GCSE numbers and strong ancient history GCSE numbers. So we currently have 123 year 11 history students across 5 classes and 44 ancient history GCSE students across 2 classes. I've got 6 GCSE classes in year 10. I'll have another 6 coming up in September. And we are still running a class or 2 classes for the ancient history GCSE, one for each, one for the other. And I've never had this issue of it impacting numbers, ever. If anything, it just brings more students, therefore more money and more resources into the department. Steve, I could not agree more with what you said. I've never had the issue. And like Steve, I'm very happy to provide any anecdotal evidence that anyone's SLT needs, that all people's departments might need, to just remind them, you're not going to lose numbers. We've just seen our history numbers grow.
Oh, thanks ever so much, Anna. Okay, so we will turn our attention now to Key Stage 5, and I will hand over to Emma.
Hi there, I'm bringing up my PowerPoint to get it to share at the right bit. Sorry, I'm just scrolling through. Okay, so just let me know that that's sharing if with a thumbs up, but it's 1 minute. Sorry, technical difficulties my end. I'm not very tech savvy, so slideshow, slide. Is that showing?
Yep, all good.
Okay, great. So yeah, hi, I'm Emma Beetham. I teach A-level ancient history at York College, and I just teach ancient history, and that is all. I did start out teaching modern and ancient history, and then over the last, well, I've been here 17 years, it doesn't feel like it, but for 17 years, the department's grown. And I do kind of, following on from Anna and Steve with numbers and things, I've got some numbers to show you the numbers of students we've got in the different histories that we offer. But when I started out teaching here, there was a group finishing off which was doing the classical civilizations archaeology module in second year, and one group of ancient history at AS, because it was newly introduced when I picked it up as an NQT, like Anna was mentioning. And then since then, I now have had 4 groups of first years and 3 groups of second years. So I've seen it grown, and I'll show you the numbers, as I say, in a bit, that it doesn't actually eat into the modern numbers. But I'm just going to go through about what we teach in ancient history at A-level and some of the barriers that you might think you have to overcome, but it's not necessarily a barrier. So when I get my students coming to do AS ancient history, very, very few of them have done GCSE ancient history. So they've done history, but not GCSE ancient history. And one of the conditions at coming to the college to do history is that they have to have a minimum of a grade 6 in their English language or history if they've done history. If they haven't done history at GCSE, we do still accept them on because of blocks and how it might work in their school, as long as they're keen, interested, and have got a grade 6 in English language to prove they're competent readers and writers, because that's obviously what we wanted for history students. So the key thing that we look for is, and we show between bridging the gap between knowledge at GCSE to AS, is that we show that there is the same skills that they've acquired through GCSE, and that is transferable over to A-level ancient history. It is the content, the names, the places, the period of time, which is different, but that means that they've come in with, you know, the skills that they are needing in order to do the topics that we study. So in GCSE, they will have been taught analysis, evaluation, cause and consequence, change over time, significance of events, individuals, groups, and it is using those skills and just transferring them over to a different time period. Students that I get are usually the ones that are keen and interested in history in general, and they may have already done Hitler, you know, Nazi Germany at GCSE, and they just have a real keen interest in history and decide that they just want to go for a different era of history, want to expand their knowledge, and therefore they choose ancient history. Now, at our college, we do offer 3 histories that they can study, 3 A-levels. So we've got ancient history, early modern, and modern history that they can choose from. And if students are really super keen, they can choose 2 histories as two of their 4 choices, because our students do 4 ASs in the first year and drop to 3 in the second year, which I'll show in the numbers in a little bit. So some of the super keen ones can do ancient history alongside early modern, or ancient history alongside modern history. And there is a few students each year that do both, especially if they're thinking of going off to do history or something related in the future. So the students that I get then have come with a keen interest to do history and supplement either the modern or early modern with ancient, or just with ancient. And as I just mentioned before about the types of skills that they have when they come to do A-level, one of the variations that they might find different and not necessarily use some of those skills to look at is types of evidence. That is a slight change over an A-level. So we do look at a lot more archaeology, so buildings, temples, scriptures, etc. in buildings, coins, drama, literature, and pottery. So it's using those skills that they've already acquired and just adapting it to different parts of evidence. So in first year, they do 2 modules, a period study, which is the Greek module, and then they do the period study with the Rome module, which is the Julian Claudian emperors. And the Rome module kind of focuses a lot more on the coins, the poetry, and we look at that, and we look at it obviously from a historical point of view rather than an English literature point of view. So just to kind of give you an idea is that some students have not done much or very little ancient history. I have a mixed level when they come to me. So you've got the students that might have read or know all about Percy Jackson and read all those and got a real keen interest to know about myths, mythology, etc. And some that have just can name me a couple of gods, goddesses, and just thought, I fancy a change of time period. And so we're kind of dealing with a mixed level of knowledge when they first come in. So when they first start out, I kind of a foundation kind of few lessons just to get everybody kind of up to the same speed and the same level. Intro lessons on skills that they have already got and how we can adapt them to the subject that we're doing. And also we look at the ideas that glossaries, a lot of scaffolding, a lot of looking at books, work booklets, glossaries, etc. And we use all that when we come to do our lessons. So here, for example, is a poem that we look in the Rome module, which is by Horace and the suicide of Cleopatra. So at first you get a lot of the students going, oh, we're doing English literature again. I didn't choose English literature. I was supposed to be in history. And yeah, that is true. So we need to look at this from a different angle and a different point of view, because yes, you might have looked at poetry before in English, but some of them may have done some of the poetry from World War I, for example, but they probably don't remember any of that from back in year 7 or whenever they might have done it. So we look at kind of poems and we look at the skills. So what can we see from this? Link it to the historiography, bring it back to, what are we talking about in terms of when Caesar pursued her as she flew from Italy, what does that all mean? And we link it back to the subject that we've actually been doing in the history of everything. So in terms of incorporating all of this into teaching, I find that having kind of scaffolding at the beginning in terms of work booklets and glossaries helps a lot with kind of overcoming that barrier of finding the glossary, the key terms, the new words and language a little bit difficult for some of them, but after a while they pick it up and everything kind of like helps with what I've done. So in terms of numbers, this is just some of the last year's figures that we have got here. So you can see from 2020 and 21, these are the entries that we had for our 3 subjects, the number of AS students. So 66 ancient history, as you can see, 92 and 32. And then the year after, 71, 69 and 24. I'm not quite sure what the anomaly was there. We kind of had more ancient history students than modern history. And then this year our entry was, as you can see, 73 ancient history, 84 and 30. And then so we can see we've got real healthy numbers, and those this year is just kind of a little bit of a different year, but we can see that it's quite steady numbers, and we're not taken away from the modern or the early modern. We're just adding another layer of history, and we like to see it as another way of curriculum enhancing for the students, that they can actually choose a period of history or 2 periods if they, as I say, if they want to. And it just enforces that idea of the love of the subject. If you really love history and you love reading and you love writing and you love finding out about the past, and you've got this curiosity of mind, then you can see that the numbers speak for themselves, that it doesn't then make less modern history groups or early modern history groups. It just adds more students. It just adds, as you say, more funding, more numbers, etc. And then the conversion rate who decide to stay on for the second year, as I mentioned, our students do 4 subjects and then hone into the final 3 that they want to do at A-level in the second year. So we enter them all for the AS exams as well. So they will all get a qualification if they decide that they only want to do ancient history in the first year. They sit the AS exam, they get a qualification. So effectively, when they've left our college, they're coming out with 3.5 A-levels. So that is why the numbers slightly dip, because they might have chosen not to do a history as their 3 A-levels. So it might have been a 4th choice just to kind of keep their curriculum understanding open. So when they write to universities and go on the UCAS process, they've at least got a broad sense of different subjects. So we do get quite a few students that do, you know, a couple of sciences and a maths and go, oh, I throw a history in there so I can keep my options open. They usually, that doesn't, the results aren't particularly different from those students, but that's normally how it's accountable. So you can see this year I've currently got 73 students in first year and I've got 46 students in my second year. They've just left, but that's my numbers. So I just thought I'd show you the idea of university applications as well, and that just because we do ancient, modern and early modern, ancient history again doesn't actually take away from people applying to universities. These are just a few figures that I could get my hands on. So for last year's entry, the 2022 entry, 5 students, as you can see, did both modern and ancient, applied for modern history. Now, there were more students that did both, but these just happened to go on to do the subject. 1 student who did both applied for military studies. 2 students who did both histories, did ancient, and 4 who just did ancient history, just as 1 went on to do ancient history. So we get quite a good conversion rate of students wanting to go off and do history or ancient or something in that. I didn't include classics in that, but we did have, I think it was when I looked, 3 students went off and did classics, and then there was a variation of archaeology with ancient history as well. And any questions?
Brilliant. Thanks ever so much, Emma. And yes, we do have 1 question in the chat for you.
Oh, right. Okay.
So Joanna has asked, do you have, or do you use the same exam board across all 3 periods, like periods of history that you offer?
It's no, it's OCR for ancient history and Edexcel for the Pearson Edexcel for the early modern and modern. Now they can only choose 2 because they can't choose modern and early modern together, because that is the same exam board. So that would then mean they're just replicating the same qualification. So they can do one of those online, but yeah, separate exam board.
much. If anyone else does have any questions, please use the chat now. And thank you ever so much for that really thorough presentation, Emma. I'm just going to finish off today's webinar by just going back over some of the information that I've sort of touched upon in various webinars and also at conference if you joined us there. Just to remind you of the amount of support that is available if you are interested in offering ancient history for the first time, regardless of key stage. The Historical Association is a great place to start. It's through the HA that this collaboration has come up, and two subject associations working together to support both of our networks of teachers. And I know that the HA are currently working to develop their ancient history provision in terms of CPD and resources as well. Please do contact me. We have a very vast network of ancient history teachers, many of whom are like Anna and Emma and who also teach modern history too. At the CA, we also are developing resources that support ancient history across the key stages. We're currently doing some work on bringing out some exemplar schemes of work for both GCSE and A-level. We have a podcast series which is focused on the A-level specification. And we're also putting together some source books to support the A-level specification. So there is plenty on offer out there. And as Steve has mentioned, Classics for All do a lot of work in supporting teachers at Key Stage 3, and they can offer sort of introductory lessons. But between, particularly the Classical Association and Classics for All, we have a very large network of teachers who would be more than willing to just freely hand you their resources or schemes of work that you could take and adapt and fit to your departments. Alongside those are probably the biggest organisations. There are two others, the Society for the Promotion of Roman and Hellenic Studies, and both of these organisations offer grants for textbooks. So if there are financial concerns that you're worried that you might not be able to afford it in terms of a whole suite of textbooks, this is something that could potentially be covered for you. Likewise, in terms of training needs between all of these organisations, there are people on hand that would be more than willing to come out to your school and offer bespoke training one-to-one, either just as an individual teacher or as a department-wide. I know that Anna does this for Classics for All, and I've often done it, sometimes remotely as well. So we are, as a group of organisations, very willing to support teachers that are new to this teaching, to the teaching of ancient history across all the levels. There is also a number of CPD events and resources available from OCR, which is the exam board that offers ancient history at GCSE and at A-level. And the next webinar, our final webinar in the series, is going to be focused on the GCSE specification. We're going to look at that one a bit more detail. And we're going to be joined by two of OCR subject representatives, Alex, who leads Classics, and Rich, who leads History, looking, I suppose, in a bit more detail at the GCSE specification and how it compares to history. And Alex will be able to talk you through the sort of CPD sessions that are on offer from OCR and the resources that they have. So please do join us for that on the 21st, that's next Wednesday at 4 p.m. And if you've missed any of the recordings from previous sessions, then you can find them on the Classical Association's YouTube channel or on the HA website. But I'm conscious that this whole webinar series has just been information overload, perhaps. And so if you ever just want to drop me a line and I can chat to you one-to-one, you can follow us on all the usual social media platforms to keep abreast of any of the resources we're developing, any CPD events that we are running, and any initiatives that we are able to sort of advertise and support to new teachers. So I'm just going to come out of that now and see if we have any final questions. Is teaching ancient history more inclusive than teaching classical civilization? If so, why? That's a great question. We can open this up to Anna and Steve and Emma. From my experience of teaching both subjects, I think ancient history has offered greater opportunities for conversations around diversity and inclusivity, particularly when teaching civilizations that are very, very much removed from the West. And I think certainly teaching Persia was, for me, like really quite groundbreaking in being able to have some very meaningful conversations, and as well as, you know, teaching Roman Egypt as well, really opened up some conversations around ethnicity, around women. And although I was able to do that in the classical civilization classroom, I think at present, I mean, as a community, we are currently working our way towards reform. I think at present, as it stands, the specification, I think ancient history is more diverse than classical civilization. That might shift as we move through the next reform point. We hope it does. But that, I think certainly there are more avenues for opening up those different, perhaps sometimes very sensitive conversations in ancient history. Anna, your thoughts?
Yeah, so funnily enough, like I said, I did my master's about 18 months ago, and what I was interested in was the year 9 ancient history unit that I do, the ancient Middle East, that's a precursor to the depth study, the period study for Greece on the GCSE. And I was really interested in how students responded to being taught about the ancient Middle East. And my data anyway, and I surveyed about 127 of my year 9s and then did some qualitative interviews as well. I found that and I'm going to use very broad terms, which I know are rapidly being replaced, but we'll say BAME or minoritized ethnic students, really responded to the study of the ancient Middle East. And what was interesting in the data that I found was that phrases that kept coming up again and again. And then these are students who interestingly went on to do the GCSE. And then I quizzed them again at the end of their GCSE about 5-6 weeks ago to see if they still had these ideas and still had these perceptions. That interesting, my Black and Asian students, both Christian and Muslim of diverse backgrounds, said that they felt that studying the ancient world gave them an opportunity to look at minoritized ethnic, I mean, I'm putting phrases there, they said Asian history, Black history, that wasn't connected to the West or didn't seem to depend on white history. And they said that it felt like not tokenistic. My students kept saying to me that they felt that sometimes when they did Black history or African history, it kind of felt like it was tacked on or it was done because you had to do it. Whereas when they were doing Persia, and I agree with you, Grania, I think it's a really groundbreaking unit, that it's completely isolated. It is in and of itself. So it doesn't depend on the advent of European colonialism. It doesn't depend on European empires. It doesn't depend on an interplay with white peoples. It is the history in and of itself, empowering in and of itself. I have certainly found in my setting, very, very mixed with my students, ranging abilities and backgrounds, that it has offered them a more inclusive study of the past. And I say as someone who's worked very hard to put together a Key Stage 3 curriculum that is varied and inclusive and representative and questioning and all the things that a curriculum should be. I only saw the classical civilization GCSE briefly. And the last thing I'll say on it is that I think that question you're asking there, Joanna, about classical civilization versus ancient history is, there was a conference a couple of years ago about the canon of Roman and Greek history and how do we break that open. And I think my personal take is that ancient history does a better job of moving beyond the canon of Roman and Greek history than classical civilization does at the moment. But that is not to say classical civilization doesn't. I also agree with Steve that I think that there's some excellent bits in Class Civ if you want to do it, but Class Civ can't offer you that study of Egypt and Cleopatra or Persia or Alexander the Great taking over Asia. I think there's certainly things to think about.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that, you know, the upper A level, particularly the classical civilization specification is much more diverse than it used to be. And I think there's some really very celebrated and brilliant topics up there, Convention of the Barbarian, Love and Relationships, that do enable classrooms to explore some very, very sensitive discussions. But again, I think it is thinking about the fact that that's sort of through the lens of the source material, whereas as Anna said, that the Persia, some of the topics that you teach at ancient history is just understanding those topics and celebrating them for what they are, rather than thinking of them through the lens of some of the Western source material. Steve, is there anything you'd like to come in with on that question?
Yeah, so as I was typing there, Joanna, I think my fat fingers got in the way, and I meant to say I wouldn't say that one is more or less inclusive, but I think I've I misunderstood perhaps your question, Joanna, because I was understanding inclusive to mean that we weren't excluding pupils with special educational needs or pupils with poor literacy or pupils who were unlikely to get a 4 at GCSE English, because that was a conversation I had with senior leaders, whether ancient history was more challenging and therefore certain students should be steered away from it. So I suppose it depends what you mean by inclusive, because Gronya and Anna were thinking about the diversity within ancient history, and I would agree with that. If you mean inclusive as in it's more challenging and therefore maybe those students who are not going to get a 4 at English should be steered towards Class Civ, I would say absolutely not. Ancient history is for them. So it depends what you mean by inclusive. I suppose I should have asked for clarification.
Emma, any final thoughts?
Just the same as what we've said, and I think picking up from what Steve has said, that it doesn't make it more accessible, the fact that you do get with ancient history. We mentioned about sources, or you get a list of sources, you know exactly what the specification wants you to have read. I produce source booklets for them, so in certain for AS, the Greek relations module, for example, so it's accessible. So as long as they understand the sources, who's wrote it, that thinking about the context of the source, the writer, all of that together, it helps. It's not a shock when they come to the exam and suddenly, oh my goodness me, there's a poem. I've never done a poem before, or I can't remember how to do a poem. They'll have already have seen, the Shield of Aeneas or whatever it might have been, and they've done that in class. So it's like a bit of a comfort blanket that, I know. So I always, it's the idea that we build on those skills. So when it gets to the exam, they just need to remember the types of evidence and who they are, and let's kind of hone in those skills. So that's the thing about the abilities. It can be usable for variable abilities.
Yeah, and I think that is reflected in the specifications for both classical civilization and ancient history at both GCSE and A-level are designed with the fact that there are non-specialist students coming into this. They aren't designed off the back of Key Stage 3 curriculum, or expected that students will have done X at whichever level. They are designed for students that will be new to this from scratch, and so therefore they are able to, students of the whole ability range are able to access these. Anna, sorry.
And I actually just wanted to add, Joanna, I've just seen that you said about the dyspraxic element as well of the learning, that Grinders mentioned earlier that there's a massive community of us who have just made loads of resources, loads of bits. And actually myself and a friend, colleague, Peter Wright, who teaches at the Blackpool Sixth Form College, and he teaches the ancient history A-level. We've worked to kind of make adapted source booklets for the GCSE for the Alexander and Cleopatra units, because I, like Steve, do Alexander and Cleopatra. They are absolutely stunning units, love them. So I have similar issues with students of my own, Joanna, who they're literally, the enthusiasm absolutely there and the ability is there, but breaking down the source has been something we've worked on. So we've got sources to help with dyslexic and breaking down sources and understanding words, glossaries. And like Emma was saying, that when it comes to the depth study units at GCSE and A-level, no source is a surprise. That they've been told what all the sources are in advance. And actually, you can even think about gaming a little bit to be like, well, which is the most common person who's more likely to come up? How can I make them feel more supported? So in terms of that SEND need of students or supporting reading, like there's loads out there. Just get on the Facebook group, get in touch with us. There's nothing we can't help you with, I would say.
Hey, Joanna, I hope that answers your question. And as Anna just said, if you'd like to, take this conversation forward, then please do drop me a line, and we can take it from there. It just leaves me now to thank Anna, Steve, and Emma for joining this afternoon to present, and also to all of you for joining on what is a very hot afternoon. I hope you're all able to get into your gardens and enjoy a glass of wine or a gin and tonic or a water if you're sensible.